In a bustling inn, the air buzzed with chatter as people swapped tales of their adventures and triumphs. In one corner, a young man sat quietly, observing the lively crowd, wondering if this modest inn was truly the famous hub for merchants and travelers he'd heard about. His name was Ju Yun, a warrior who carried a carefully wrapped spear. He felt a quiet relief at reaching this place safely and was even more pleased by the locals' kindness, whether it stemmed from genuine warmth or their assumption that he was a skilled fighter. A group of adventurers invited Ju Yun to join their guild and work alongside them, but he politely declined. He explained that he wasn't there for work but for a personal mission, a dream to chase, a promise he had to keep. That was his priority, and nothing would sway him. No one seemed eager to stop him, though a bald man in the group issued a grave warning. Ju Yun should be cautious while moving through the area. Naturally curious, Ju Yun asked what he meant. With a grim expression, the man explained that a dangerous monster prowled near the village. A cruel, bloodthirsty figure who hunted martial artists and carried their severed heads to terrify others. Ju Yun nodded, seemingly impressed by the chilling tale, but in truth, he was no stranger to such stories. Sipping his tea calmly, he acted as if this was precisely why he'd come. Mid-conversation, the inn's door swung open and someone, or something, stepped inside, instantly seizing everyone's attention. It was the very man they'd been discussing. A monstrous, wild-looking figure with his infamous bloody bag. He dropped it onto the floor with a heavy thud and strode forward. His presence alone sent shivers through the room, freezing everyone in their seats. Everyone except Ju Yun, who either didn't recognize him or didn't care. The others, terrified, only dared whisper among themselves, questioning if this was truly the monster of legend. With an irritated scowl, the man barked at the attendant to fetch the innkeeper immediately. Nervously, the attendant explained that the innkeeper was out running an errand but offered to assist in the meantime. Trying to be polite, the attendant reached for what he assumed was the man's luggage, intending to carry it to a quiet room until the innkeeper returned. But as he glanced at the bag, he froze, realizing it wasn't luggage at all. Still, he steeled himself to lift it, only for the man to grab his hand, halting him mid-motion. The room fell deathly silent. Everyone watched in terror, fearing the attendant's fate was sealed. With a chilling glare, the monstrous man declared loudly that the bag held his prey, and no one but him had the right to touch it. The attendant panicked, trembling uncontrollably, stammering out an apology for his disrespect. The unsettling scene sparked murmurs among the crowd, whispers that this man was every bit as ruthless as the rumors claimed. But before he could act further, the bag twitched, its movement catching his attention. His expression darkened as he turned toward it. In a voice that sent shivers down every spine, he muttered an apology to his prey, saying he regretted letting it suffer and would now end its misery. As his hand reached for the bag, someone sprang into action, stopping him cold. That someone was Ju Yun. Not only did he dare to intervene, but he stood tall and fearlessly challenged the monstrous man to an honor duel. The room went silent in disbelief. No one, not even the bald man from earlier, had anticipated this. People wondered if Ju Yun had lost his mind. The monstrous man, a fresh scar now visible on his face, turned to Ju Yun, his lips curling into a mocking grin. His tone dripped with disdain as he sneered, "You against me?" Ju Yun, brimming with confidence, boldly declared that he'd come to confront the greatest enemy of the martial world, the one responsible for the suffering of every soul in the region. And he meant this man, no one else. He added that this was the dream and oath that had driven him all this way. Hearing what sounded like a childish speech, the wild-looking man smirked, then erupted into laughter that echoed for miles. With a grin, he asked why Ju Yun believed he was the so-called greatest enemy of the martial world. Before Ju Yun could reply, the man waved it off as if he already knew the answer. Letting out a heavy sigh, the man began to explain that not only Ju Yun but everyone had misunderstood him entirely. But before he could finish, Ju Yun cut him off, mocking him outright. It was clear Ju Yun thought the man was making excuses to avoid a fight. With a loud clang, Ju Yun slammed his spear into the ground, declaring once more that he'd come all this way for one reason: to find and defeat him. No excuses would be tolerated. Seeing Ju Yun's resolve, the monstrous man gave him an unreadable glance and said, "If that's the case, I accept your challenge. But I need to prepare first." Ju Yun froze, shocked by the response, then narrowed his eyes and shouted, "Don't tell me you're planning to run away." Before he could get an answer, the crowd erupted, yelling at Ju Yun, asking if he'd gone mad. They insisted the infamous monster before him wasn't the type to back down from a fight. There was no way he'd flee to avoid facing Ju Yun. In their eyes, this ruthless man, who cared little whether his foes were rogues or saints and would do anything to win, had no reason to dodge a mere boy like him. The crowd tried to stop Ju Yun, voicing their concerns and practically begging him to reconsider. They were convinced he was walking into a death trap, that fighting this man was as good as suicide. But Ju Yun wouldn't budge. He'd sworn an oath, and no amount of warnings or fear could shake his resolve. He aimed to become the greatest in the world, and to do that, he had to defeat the most hated and feared figure around. Soon after, Ju Yun reluctantly agreed to give the man a short time to prepare. The monster disappeared into a room, ostensibly to get ready. At first, it seemed he might be plotting something for the duel, but that wasn't the case. This monstrous, cruel-looking man was, in fact, our protagonist, the servant boy who'd survived all those years ago. His name was Yule, and he wasn't preparing for a fight at all. Instead, he was desperately trying to buy time, searching for a way to escape without facing Ju Yun. He'd only come to the inn to sell his prey, not to stir trouble. That prey? A small boar he'd barely managed to hunt earlier, not the head of some martial artist as the rumors suggested. Yule wondered why he never got a chance to clear up the misunderstanding that painted him not just as a villain but as the martial world's greatest enemy. He knew better than anyone that he couldn't even tap into his inner power, a crippling flaw for a fighter in that era. At best, he was a third-rate warrior, the equivalent of an E-rank nobody. He couldn't help but think people judged him solely by his menacing appearance. Panicked by the mess he'd stumbled into, Yule racked his brain for a way to avoid dying in a duel with this relentless stranger. Ju Yun's reckless charge, sparked simply because Yule had kindly stopped the attendant from touching his dirty bag, made him realize just how dire his situation was. Yule didn't want to die so easily, especially not at the hands of some brash, good-looking warrior. He, too, had dreams and promises to keep, ones that had kept him alive all this time. And fate, with its twisted sense of timing, chose that moment to intervene. The girl Yule had been thinking of, Seol, entered the same village by chance. The commotion Ju Yun caused, shouting for the demon sword of chaos to face him, caught her attention. Having heard the rumors about this so-called demon, she decided to investigate. As she arrived, Seol gently tapped Ju Yun on the neck. When he turned to see who it was, his eyes widened in shock. She removed her hat, revealing her face, and asked if he was the one planning to fight the demon sword of chaos. Her striking red eyes, perfectly matched with her pink and silver hair, and her breathtaking figure left Ju Yun's heart racing, his face flushed, just like everyone else around them. Before he could respond, a man's voice broke the moment, exclaiming that she was the Lunar Sword, direct disciple of the former greatest martial artist. Say ha. Ju Yun couldn't help but assume she, like him, had come to take down the martial world's greatest enemy, the demon sword of chaos. Determined not to miss this chance to make a name for himself alongside her, he boldly proposed they team up, saying it would be an honor if she'd help him kill Yule, the infamous demon. Seol finally grasped what was happening and couldn't have been happier, not because of the duel or Ju Yun, but because she'd located her long-lost love after 15 years. She couldn't wait another second to see him. Her reaction baffled Ju Yun, who thought she was impressed by his bravery. He even began daydreaming that she'd chosen him as a partner, perhaps even romantically. As Seol started walking forward, Ju Yun suggested again that they join forces to defeat Yule and then form a powerful partnership to travel the world. Meanwhile, inside the inn, chaos reigned for Yule. Still unaware of the storm brewing outside, he was frantically trying to avoid the duel. He couldn't stop thinking that his best option was to report the situation to the authorities. Dueling was, after all, forbidden by law. Just as he resolved to do his duty as a citizen, the inn's wooden wall exploded, slashed apart by a sword in a dramatic entrance. Yul leapt to a corner, trembling as he sought cover. It was Ju-yoon, or so he thought. Seeing him, Yul screamed in terror, convinced his life was over before he could marry Seol. Crawling backward, he stammered excuses, saying he wasn't ready, that Ju-yoon should wait, that this was a private room he shouldn't enter. His panicked rambling halted when Seol stepped inside. "Finally, I found you," she said. Yul was speechless, either from seeing the love of his life or from realizing she was the one who'd made that dramatic entrance. In an instant, it clicked. It wasn't Ju-yoon who'd shattered the wall but Seol, using the unconscious boy's body to prove what happens when someone disrespects the lunar sword's precious, long-lost lover. Tossing Ju-yoon's battered form to the ground, Seol turned to Yul and approached him. She proudly declared that she'd become one of the continent's strongest martial artists and now had more than enough wealth to build a perfect life for them both. Money she'd earned herself, not inherited. Stepping closer, she gazed at the boy she loved, the one everyone else called the Demon Sword of Chaos. Neither his hated title nor his pitiful state could sway her feelings. Without hesitation, she looked into his eyes and asked him to marry her, boldly stating that nothing and no one could stop them now. Unlike what the crowd outside imagined, an explosive clash between the greatest hero, the Lunar Sword, and the most feared villain, the Demon Sword of Chaos. Unlike what the crowd outside imagined, an explosive clash between the greatest hero, the Lunar Sword, and the most feared villain, the Demon Sword of Chaos. The scene in the small room was surprisingly calm. Yul, a bit clueless, didn't immediately recognize Seol, even after her reminder of his promise. He stared at her blankly, then pointed to a door behind him. "You're looking for the Demon Sword of Chaos, right? He just left," he said. But with his face plastered on wanted posters everywhere, he knew the flimsy trick wouldn't work. When she didn't respond, he figured it was his chance to bolt. Awkwardly, he shuffled toward the exit, mumbling apologies and claiming urgent business. But Seol gently grabbed his hand, stopping him. He braced for the worst, thinking it might be his end. Instead, she did something unexpected. She pulled off his glove and pressed his hand to her cheek, a gesture that echoed how he'd once shown his affection. Feeling his touch, even guided by her, made her blush as it had in the past. Softly, she asked him to say her name again. Finally, the forgetful Yul began to realize who she was. "Are you Lady Seol?" he ventured. Suddenly, joyful memories of their secret love flooded back. Sold into Seol's wealthy family as a slave during a famine, he'd never expected kindness, let alone love, from their youngest daughter. He realized how much he'd missed those days. Snapping back to reality, he found himself seated near the girl he'd once secretly adored, now in a private room. Glancing at her quietly, he saw that Seol hadn't just matured into a woman. She'd become more beautiful than anyone he'd ever known. Yet, even knowing who she was, Yul felt uneasy sitting so close. The silence broke when Seol asked why he wasn't drinking his tea. Startled, he thanked her awkwardly and said he'd drink it right away, adding "my lady" to be polite. Instantly, Seol's expression darkened. She reminded him of their promise, that he wouldn't call her lady. Not wanting to upset her, Yul hesitated, then tried Lady Seol. It still wasn't enough. She hated how formal and distant it sounded, as if he were speaking to a stranger. Blushing and too embarrassed to meet her gaze, he finally mustered the courage to say her name plainly. "Seol," he murmured, adding that he was happy to see her again. That simple sentence lit up her face, turning her back into the cheerful girl he remembered. She beamed, saying she was even happier to see him. Her radiant beauty and warm reaction made it hard for Yul to rein in his wandering thoughts. To distract himself, he pointed to her sword and asked if she'd truly become a martial artist. Though she'd said it before, she proudly repeated that she'd worked tirelessly to become one of the greatest, all for the sake of the one she loved. Yul didn't outwardly show he'd remembered their promise, But Seol could never forget the image of him shouting that he'd become strong and wealthy enough to be worthy of marrying her someday. Took a moment, but his jaw dropped as realization hit. Seol assumed he, like her, had never forgotten, and his shock came from seeing she remembered too. She explained how she tracked him down after hearing rumors of the demon sword of chaos. Hearing his infamous title made Yul flinch, expecting her to tease him, but she didn't. Instead, she recounted tales about the demon sword, harassing women, skipping out on bills, stories that oddly matched Yul's mischievous behavior as a slave. It dawned on her that the feared figure was the same boy she'd loved. Grasping his dirty hand firmly, she declared that she didn't care what the world thought of him. Cruel, hated, or even a bit perverse. She loved him as he was and wanted only one thing: to marry him. Unlike Seol, who was eager to wed and start a family, Yul wasn't on the same page. Not only did he show no interest in marriage, but he scrambled for excuses to avoid it. He quickly latched onto one, claiming a massive debt stood in their way, something tying him down. For once, he wasn't entirely lying. In the past, Yul had tried countless times to learn martial arts and grow stronger, but every master he approached kicked him out after seeing his pitiful potential, keeping his hard-earned money. One desperate day, broke and hopeless, someone had appeared, offering him cash, but in return, Yul had to agree to a favor. The scene shifted to the Eternal Bureau Guild, where a woman dressed provocatively, sans undergarments, introduced herself as one of the guild's leaders, Han Kyung. She was the one who'd saved Yul by lending him money. And now, Seol had come all this way to resolve the obstacle keeping Yul from marrying her. Seol didn't hold back, accusing Han Kyung of manipulating men like Yul, paying off their debts only to control them. This was Seol's conclusion, based solely on Yul's explanation, but Han Kyung looked genuinely baffled by the accusation. In truth, she was more like a sugar mommy to Yul, supporting him financially without asking much in return. Yul now regretted dragging his only ally into this mess. Unlike others who despised him for no reason, Han Kyung had paid off his debts and covered his living costs. The real reason Yul used the debt excuse wasn't the money itself. It was how he thought Seol saw him. He believed she assumed he'd become the worthy man he'd promised to be, a warrior on her level. The fear of her discovering the truth later, perhaps beating him in a fit of rage, terrified him. In a panic, he'd recklessly pulled Han Kyung into the fray, hoping she'd help him dodge marriage. Seeing his pleading expression, Han Kyung caught on quickly. She figured Yul had brought Seol here to use her influence to escape the situation. When Seol demanded to know Yul's total debt, Han Kyung hesitated, then decided to throw out an absurdly high number, something Seol couldn't possibly pay. With confidence, she announced that clearing Yul's debt would cost 10,000 gold coins. Yul grinned inwardly, knowing Seol couldn't muster such a sum, especially for someone like him. Even if she tried, it'd take years, buying him time to slip away. He suggested they head back and think it over. But to everyone's shock, Seol pulled out a massive bag of gold coins, seemingly from nowhere, stuffed with more than enough to cover the debt. Yul and Han Kyung gaped, wondering where she'd gotten it. Yul's plan had crumbled, and his disappointed look didn't escape Seol's notice. She assumed he felt ashamed that she was paying off his debt. To comfort him, she gently reassured him that once they were married, there'd be no his money or hers. Everything would be theirs. She added that nothing spent on Yul was ever wasted. Her words pierced his unworthy heart, forcing him to rethink his stance. Han Kyung, still stunned by the pile of gold, far more than she'd asked for, realized Yul was being dragged into an unwanted marriage. Determined to push Seol away, she stood with a mischievous glint in her eye and shouted, "Hold on!" As Seol and Yul turned to leave, Han Kyung stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Yul in a tight hug, either feigning a relationship or hinting at the truth behind her support. Yul was caught off guard, and Seol's eyes widened in disbelief. Ignoring Seol for a moment, Han Kyung whispered to Yul, "Don't panic, I'll handle this girl for you." But things didn't go as she'd hoped. Seol's reaction was swift and fierce. Her glowing sword materialized in her hand, her body crackling with wild lightning. She glared at Han Kyung and demanded, "Step away from Yul right now, or I'll make you." By force. In that moment, both Han Kyung and Yul realized they were in deep trouble. They had two choices: separate peacefully or face Seol's wrath. As Seol advanced, Han Kyung regretted her move, while Yul desperately begged Seol to calm down, insisting it was a misunderstanding. Seol ignored them, her eyes deadly serious. She might actually kill them both. Panicking, Yul blurted out, "Stay calm, Seol. You're someone really important to me." That single sentence worked like magic, dousing her fury. She paused, reverting to her usual self. Yul sighed in relief, knowing they were safe. But though her anger faded, Seol was heartbroken, devastated by the thought that the man she loved had betrayed her with a sugar mommy. Yul tried to apologize and explain there was no love between him and Han Kyung, but Seol refused to hear it. Without a word, she turned and headed for the door. Yul chased after her, desperate to stop her and explain, but she kept walking. He hadn't meant to hurt her, but Han Kyung seemed pleased with the outcome. To her, it was the perfect way to halt an unwanted marriage, the very reason Yul had come here. Yul turned to her, stunned but not blaming her wild actions. His expression conveyed his regret for hurting Seol. Han Kyung returned to her seat, sharing tales of her life as a guild leader and merchant, satisfied with her unconventional but effective solution. Yul, however, felt no joy in achieving his goal, only guilt. Minutes later, on the other side of the village, something drew the villagers' attention. The demon Sword of Chaos walked among them, his dark presence and aura impossible to ignore, or so they thought. In reality, it was just Yul, lost in regret for wounding Seol and making it seem like he'd cheated. The sadness brought back memories of his days as a lowly servant, when Seol had treated him with boundless kindness, seeing him as an ordinary boy worthy of her love. Yul wondered why, despite all his efforts to bridge the gap between them, her kindness and his love always felt out of reach. Resolving to find her and tell her the truth, he overheard a man telling his wife he'd seen a white-haired woman in white racing through the mountains toward a cliff, as if fleeing a ghost. Yul's heart sank. He knew it was Seol, and he feared she meant to end her life over his recklessness. Moments later, the woman trembled in fear, not from her husband's tale, but from spotting Yul. He stepped forward, asking where the man had seen the woman. Minutes later, panting and breathless, Yul reached the spot. Unsure if he was in the right place, he scanned the area, and there, at the cliff's edge, stood a figure ready to leap. Convinced it was Seol, he dashed forward without hesitation, hugging her from behind. "I'll marry you right now if you reconsider," he cried. But to his shock, it wasn't Seol. It was a 200-year-old grandpa, who froze in surprise. The old man's face turned red, flustered by the thought of a young man proposing to him. Yul realized his blunder, mortified by his reckless charge. He let go, turned away, and apologized profusely, explaining he'd mistaken the man for someone else. The grandpa, however, wasn't letting him off easily. As Yul tried to leave, the old man shouted, "Are you really just going to walk away so irresponsibly?" Yul's eyes widened, realizing the man wasn't talking about himself but offering advice about Seol. "Do you even know what was reflected in that child's eyes when you hurt her?" The old man boomed, his voice laced with authority, anger, and sadness. Yul grasped his meaning, thinking the man a divine messenger guiding him. He turned to thank him and seek wisdom, only to see the old man addressing a tree. A grandchild rushed over, scolding the grandfather for wandering off again. Yul's jaw dropped, nothing made sense. The old man's words had felt so personal, yet they weren't for him at all to be. By the time Yul trudged back down the mountain, the sun was setting. He felt he'd wasted his time, yet the old man's words about not underestimating Seol's feelings gnawed at him, deepening his guilt. Arriving home, head hung low, he was so lost in thought that he didn't notice Seol standing before him. Her greeting, "Welcome home," snapped him out of it. Stunned, he shouted, "When did you get here?" Seol casually explained she'd been there all along, having found his house before their earlier encounter. Yul froze, torn between relief and guilt. He was glad she was safe, but her red, tear-streaked eyes betrayed how much she'd cried that day. She tried to deny it, but Yul persisted, knowing he'd caused her pain. He explained everything about Han Kyung, insisting it was a misunderstanding. Seol already knew the truth. There was no infidelity, but his lengths to avoid marrying her had broken her heart. Yul froze as she spoke, realizing she'd seen through him. The old man's words echoed, urging honesty. Instead of lying, he admitted he couldn't marry her. Tears welled in Seol's eyes as she apologized, avoiding his gaze. "I won't bother you anymore," she said, turning to leave. But Yul grabbed her shoulders, stopping her. "No, that's not it, Seol," he blurted. She'd expected a sweet excuse, but instead, he shouted that his monthly income was a mere 200 yen. Barely enough to feed himself, let alone support a wife. Pointing to his shabby home, he confessed he only rented it through Han Kyung's help. Without her, he'd be homeless. He didn't sugarcoat it. The rumors were exaggerated. He wasn't the mighty demon sword of chaos, nor had he fulfilled his promise. Despite breaking her trust, he didn't want to lose her. Looking into her eyes, he asked for another chance, vowing to become the man she deserved, just as he'd promised long ago. Then, impulsively, he hugged her tightly, showing his sincerity. Seol froze, unprepared for the embrace after 15 years. Yul's face burned with embarrassment, but he knew he had to take this step to propose properly. To his surprise, it worked. Seol agreed to wait until he became rich and strong enough to marry her. Neither was ready to let go just yet. Then Yul, in a moment of boldness, slid his hand lower, touching her playfully. He quickly realized it was too soon. They weren't even a couple yet, and decided to wait until they were wed. But Seol didn't pull away. She gripped him tightly, almost possessively, then pushed him back against the wall. Leaning in close, she whispered, "Let's have the wedding in front of our future kids." Their playful tussle filled the air with laughter and screams. A passerby in the alley overheard, assuming the lunar sword had finally cornered the demon sword of chaos in a fierce battle. Rumors spread like wildfire, twisting and growing with each retelling. Before long, the world buzzed with wild tales, none close to the truth. Eventually, a rumor reached a pink-haired girl that the demon sword had slain the lunar sword. Overjoyed, she nodded confidently to her companion's question about taking action. "Since one of the world's greatest stars has fallen," she said, "it's my duty to step in and make the world know my name and my guilds." A few days later, on an early, peaceful morning, Sei woke up after spending a long and wonderful night with the so-called ugly guy. She was fixing her hair with a satisfied smile on her face. At the same time, she kept glancing at the door of the house where you were still sleeping. She couldn't have been happier, knowing she no longer had to search for her childhood love. Eager for him to wake up so they could practice some wrestling techniques again. Just thinking about it made her feel excitement bubbling inside her. But her peaceful and dreamy moment was suddenly shattered when someone appeared out of nowhere, shouting angrily and calling you an ugly bastard rascal. Of course, this made Seol's mood change in an instant. The man didn't even notice her and kept yelling, "Let's end this today, demon sword of chaos." He was clearly not planning to leave until he gave you a proper beating. Despite knowing who you were, the infamous demon sword of chaos, the man seemed completely unafraid. In an instant, as he said, "I haven't forgotten what day it is," a sword appeared and pierced through the air, stopping him mid-sentence. Unsurprisingly, it was Lady Seol, who couldn't stand to see her boyfriend being insulted by this scruffy-looking man. Pressing the sword closer to him, she glared and demanded, "What's so important about today that you haven't forgotten?" Terrified and lost for words, the man froze. But before he could respond, Sei smirked and answered her own question by saying, "It's your death anniversary." Her words sent chills down his spine, but somehow he managed to muster the courage to stammer out a question. "Who even are you? I've never seen you before." Leaning in slowly, her voice low and laced with anger, Seol whispered, "I'm the mistress of this house." The man blinked in disbelief before nervously revealing the truth. He was the landlord of the house, the very house she had just claimed as being its mistress. That's when it hit Lady Seol. She had gone completely overboard again. But of course, this was just part of her personality, and there wasn't much she could do about it. The man, sensing an opportunity to defuse the situation, quickly clarified, "I'm just here to collect the rent. That's all I meant when I said I hadn't forgotten this day." Realizing her mistake, Seol stepped back, letting the awkward tension settle. With that, the uncomfortable situation came to an end. The scene shifted to the house's kitchen. There, Lady Seol, back to her usual self, was cooking up a storm like a pro chef, preparing food for the day ahead. The so-called demon sword of chaos finally woke up after all the commotion, completely clueless about why the landlord was even there. The landlord, however, wasn't about to let things slide. He was furious. Not only had you failed to pay rent for several months, but now his so-called wife had tried to kill him without even knowing who he was. And to make matters worse, this landlord was also the innkeeper whose you and Lady Seol had managed to turn into a ruined building. It all made sense why the man was shouting in anger. But you, ever the broke and resourceful man, decided to play the victim. He apologized profusely, insisting it wasn't his fault at all. The landlord, however, wasn't buying it and made it clear that an apology wasn't going to cut it. His fury was palpable until he noticed a shadowy figure watching him closely. Of course, it was none other than Lady Seol. She stood there silently with a sharp cleaver in her hand, her eyes locked on him like a predator sizing up its prey. The landlord quickly realized that, for his own safety, it might be better to handle this situation more peacefully. A few tense moments later, they all moved outside, sitting across from each other to talk things through. Seizing the opportunity while Seol wasn't around, the landlord cautiously leaned toward you and whispered, "Who is that crazy woman? And what did she mean by calling herself the mistress of this house?" At first, you were taken aback by the sudden question, but he quickly composed himself and confidently explained that it was the same woman he had mentioned before, the lady he once served and promised his future to. The ugly landlord vaguely remembered hearing this story before, but he had never imagined it was real. He always thought you were just talking about some fantasy or dream of his. Even though the landlord knew of Seol and her reputation as the Lunar Sword, he never had the chance to meet her in person. So when you mentioned her name, the man froze in shock. Part of his surprise came from the fact that he couldn't wrap his head around someone as beautiful as Seol choosing to live with someone like this ugly loser. But what truly left him stunned was realizing he had heard some unsettling rumors about them. The irony was that you were the only one completely unaware of these stories about himself and Seol. Apparently, after that magical night for you and Seol, several wild rumors had started to spread. And as an innkeeper who interacted with countless people, the landlord had heard most of them. Of course, he had dismissed them all as nonsense until now. Now, one particular rumor seemed to click. The story about how the demon sword of chaos had tricked and cowardly trapped the lunar sword by hypnotizing her, enslaving her, and forcing her to do whatever dirty, shameful things he wanted. Hearing this for the first time, you freaked out. He never imagined people would come up with such wild stories about him. But honestly, if anyone saw how Seol cared for this ugly guy, they probably wouldn't come up with a better explanation. Just then, Seol herself joined the conversation, bringing out the well-prepared food she'd made for them. Even in front of the landlord, she didn't hold back. With love and care, she started feeding her future husband as if no one else was there. You, completely caught off guard, were impressed by her boldness, while the landlord sat there watching the scene unfold. This only made him feel even more conflicted. On one hand, it made the rumors seem more believable. On the other hand, it sparked a mix of jealousy or maybe even disgust at their public display of affection. Still, being a kind-hearted man, he decided not to interfere. Instead, he chose to warn them about how the whole world now saw them as two shining opposite stars of martial arts, a pairing that had already attracted major attention. Unlike you, who always panicked at the slightest problem, Seol remained calm. Gently, she grabbed his hand and, with a loving, reassuring look, reminded him that he had nothing to worry about as long as they stood by each other's side. That one look of hers was enough to give any man the confidence to face an entire army alone. and you were no exception. You raised his hand and clenched his fist, silently vowing to himself that he would become a master no matter what. He promised to buy a proper house for her, and when that day came, nothing in the world would tear them apart. Their eyes met afterward, and they looked like they were ready to start another round of baby-making. Luckily, the landlord was still there, watching them with a disgusted expression. He made a circle with his fingers and, in a mocking voice like he could read the boy's mind, said he should probably focus on paying his rent and debts before getting carried away. To his surprise, you immediately came up with a brilliant plan for that. Hours passed, and the sun was slowly giving way to the moon. The landlord, who had been irritated earlier, now looked excited because you and Lady Seal had gone back to use Sugar Mommy to borrow some money to clear his debts. To your surprise, after he calmly explained how everything had been resolved with Seal, she didn't hesitate to return Seal's gold, something he never expected. They didn't keep the landlord waiting long and came back quickly. The man's excitement grew even more when he saw the amount of gold they brought. It was tempting enough for him to offer his shabby house in exchange for the gold right then and there. However, you turned down the offer right away. Not only did he know that the house wasn't worth that much, but even if it was, they needed to save some money for later. Besides, it was Seal's money, not his, so he couldn't just waste it like that. Hearing this, Seal grabbed the guy's hand, placed her head on his chest, and gently reminded him that the gold belonged to both of them, not just her. Like a pair of lovebirds, they started messing around, rubbing against each other and completely ignoring the landlord, who was standing there on the verge of losing his patience because of their childish behavior. Still, he didn't say anything, and all of them just headed back to their place, continuing their playful antics without a care for the landlord trying to act like he wasn't bothered. The man suddenly started talking about his plans for the house, asking you to take good care of it since he wanted to rent it out in the future. You didn't hesitate to reassure him, promising that he wouldn't let the house take even the slightest damage from now on. He hadn't even finished talking when, all of a sudden, his face and the surroundings lit up with a sudden burst of lightning. It seemed like fate was determined to mess with you, as he quickly realized that the house they were just talking about was now up in flames. It didn't take long for the other villagers to notice and gather around to watch the spectacle. Meanwhile, the landlord and you stood there in complete shock, frozen as they watched the house being devoured by fire. Slowly, the landlord reached for the bag of gold and took it, believing that you were responsible for the house's safety. You just stood there, his eyes and mouth wide open, too stunned to even try stopping him from taking the money. Things only got worse when, out of the flames, the pink-haired girl from earlier suddenly leapt forward, grinning smugly as she proudly announced she was the one behind it all. As soon as her feet hit the ground, she called out your title like she'd known him forever and went on to introduce herself. I'm the next head of the Four Heavens cult, the Poisonous Phoenix, Tang Hai. But instead of looking intimidating, she was more like a hyper 13-year-old, flat-chested and full of energy, practically bouncing as she yelled that she was there for one reason only, to assassinate him. Aside from you and his landlord, who were both completely caught off guard by all these unexpected events, the crowd was eager to see what would happen next. Tang Hai stood there fearlessly, all alone in front of the roaring flames, while the rest of the villagers formed a circle around her, watching intently. After what she clearly thought was an epic entrance, she immediately challenged the demon sword of chaos, giving you the chance to make the first move. But before she could finish basking in her moment, two massive waves of lightning suddenly shot toward her. The deadly blasts weren't aimed directly at her but passed close enough to make their presence known, destroying what little remained of the burning house behind her in an instant. Tang froze, caught off guard by the unexpected attack, and for the first time, her confidence wavered. That's when Seol stepped forward, her expression cold and determined. She announced that if Tang wanted to fight, she'd have to face her first before even thinking about going after you. Seol made it clear she could have ended Tang right then and there but chose to play fair this time. Though she wasn't holding back, she was ready to take down anyone who insulted the only reason she lived and breathed. Instead of retreating, Tang smirked, her confidence quickly returning, and declared she was more than ready to face Seol. "Long time no see, Lunar Sword," she said with a challenging grin, making it clear she was already familiar with her opponent. Lady Seal kept walking forward, surrounded by a glowing white aura and flashes of light. Ahead of her stood the overly confident, flat-chested kid, her body radiating a green, flame-like energy, waiting to confront her. Tang Hai hadn't expected to run into Seol on her way to capture you, or at least pretended not to, but she still believed Seol was no big deal and wouldn't be much of a challenge. Seol paused for a moment, visibly annoyed by Tang, who was rambling on and on like an overly excited child. Watching Seol's expression, Tang decided not to waste any more time and show her exactly what she was capable of. With confidence, she launched her secret move, fully intending to finish Seol off in one blow. Unfortunately for Tang, her plan failed miserably. Within seconds, she was half buried in the dirt, with only her head and chest sticking out. She was completely stunned at how easily she had been defeated. In the meantime, nearby villagers worked together to put out the flames that had engulfed the house. The boy didn't seem to care much about the damage, unlike the landlord, who wanted to make Tang pay for his house. Instead, he was more focused on figuring out why this hyperactive kid had suddenly shown up, burned his house down, and tried to assassinate him. Tang, despite being defeated and captured, refused to admit anything. She acted like she was the victim in all this and the demon sort of chaos was harassing her. But in reality, this was all part of her plan. As the heir to a powerful noble family, Tang wasn't about to go down without a fight, so she just needed to buy herself some time to come up with something. Just then, someone suddenly descended from the sky, landing right in the middle of the scene. It was, of course, Tang's loyal underling, a skilled martial artist. As Tang shouted, "Come forth, my royal and excellent assistant," Seol calmly placed her hand on the woman's head and used her abilities to bury her in the ground, just like she had done to Tang earlier. Tang was making a huge fuss, calling that woman every mighty and impressive title she could think of. But within seconds, before she could even realize it, her hope turned into pure disappointment when her assistant was completely defeated in a flash. You, watching the whole thing from a distance, were stunned. He couldn't believe how Seol single-handedly took down these two so-called skilled women in such a one-sided battle. Later, after the chaos had settled down, you questioned the pair to figure out why they had caused all this trouble. Tang, still brimming with misplaced confidence, boldly claimed she was just doing her duty as a hero and trying to save the world from its greatest enemy. She explained that since she couldn't find you at his house, she came up with a simple strategy: burning the house down to force him to return. It was a statement that definitely didn't sit well with the landlord, who wasn't thrilled to hear about her destructive plan. Moments later, you were completely shocked when Tang brought up one of the countless rumors she'd heard recently. She claimed that the so-called demon sword of chaos had taken Seol's parents hostage and was forcing her to do whatever he wanted. Tang even said one of her reasons for coming here was to rescue Seol and free her parents. You suddenly froze, his mind racing. Something didn't add up. Just moments ago, Tang had been trying to kill Seol, and now she was claiming she came here to save her because of some rumors? It didn't make any sense. Tang seemed to be hiding her real intentions, but to her surprise, her own assistant, the one she proudly called the Silent Demon previously, decided to spill the truth. The assistant bluntly revealed that Tang's actual goal was to use this opportunity to catch the lunar sword off guard and assassinate her, not the boy. Seol, who had been watching the whole scene with curiosity, listened carefully, wondering why Tang had targeted her. The Silent Demon didn't hold back, laying everything out in the open. She explained that it all started a year ago during a martial arts competition where Tang had been utterly defeated by the lunar sword. Tang, clearly panicking, tried to shut her assistant up. She yanked at her long hair, smacking it into the woman's face in an attempt to get her to stop talking. "You're my underling, not theirs," Tang hissed, desperate to make her come to her senses. But the assistant completely ignored her and just kept spilling the truth. The Silent Demon glanced at the aftermath of Seol's earlier attack and admitted that she too had wanted to go after her, not just to avenge Tang's defeat, but also to make a name for herself. However, She knew she wasn't strong enough to take the famous lunar sword on, so she didn't dare make a move until now. You watched in surprise as the woman went on to declare that she had also come here after hearing the same rumors, stating she planned to make a name for herself by killing two birds with one stone. Knock the demon sword of chaos out, take him down, and then swoop in as the hero who saved the lunar sword. After hearing this bizarre story, you and Seol exchanged confused looks. Were these two supposed to be master and subordinate, or were they just two random strangers who only cared about themselves? Tang, unable to handle the humiliation any longer, suddenly let out a scream that sounded like someone had just poked her in the butt with something sharp. In her frustration, Tang finally started admitting everything, confirming what her assistant had said about her true intentions. She confessed that Seol's overwhelming power hadn't just humiliated her. It had made her realize there were probably countless others out there like her, counting down the seconds, waiting for their chance to take revenge on Seol. Seol, on the other hand, didn't bother saying anything, neither to defend her reputation nor to explain her true intentions. Just then, Tang ordered her less than trustworthy assistant to move on to the backup plan before things got any worse. At first, the talkative demon didn't seem interested in cooperating. However, when Tang kept pushing, she suddenly sprang to life, leaping out of her grave and freeing herself in one swift motion. In the blink of an eye, she appeared right in front of you, catching him completely off guard. He realized he had let his guard down, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't have mattered even if he had been on high alert. As a third-rate warrior, he couldn't have reacted in time anyway. Their gazes locked, the silent demon ready to do her job, and the boy bracing himself to be torn apart. Seol, who had also let her guard down and hadn't seen this coming, quickly tried to step in and protect you. But in the very next moment, her eyes widened in shock. The demon didn't harm you. Instead, she appeared on top of a nearby cliff with someone else standing close to her. Tang's expression shifted, turning into that of a cheerful, overly confident kid again. She said casually, "This wasn't really what I wanted to do, but you forced me to use this dirty trick." That's when everything started to come to light. The silent demon suddenly brought out a 100-year-old granny from nowhere and held a knife to her throat. You reacted like he recognized the old woman, like she looked really familiar to him. Seeing this gave Tang her confidence back. She shouted at you to surrender immediately before she used his precious hostage against him to force his hand. Unfortunately for Tang, you didn't actually know who the granny was. He just felt sorry for her. That's when the atmosphere turned heavy, and an awkward silence filled the air. Everyone stood there watching him in shock. Tang, however, didn't buy it. She thought the so-called demon sword was just pretending not to know the granny so he wouldn't lose the upper hand. To snap him out of it, Tang yelled, "It's your mother, the one who gave birth to you. How can you say you don't know her?" You scratched his ugly face awkwardly and looked sad. After a moment of hesitation, he finally said, "My mom? She died when I was only 5. Tang was speechless. Her eyes went wide, and her mouth hung open in disbelief. But her shock didn't last long because everything was confirmed when the granny suddenly started shouting in anger. "My lost son's name is Yuan, not you." She went on to remind everyone, as if scolding them, that she had told them this many times before. Just as everything seemed to calm down and Tang realized she had seriously messed up this time, a wild but effective idea suddenly popped into her head. Since she had nothing to lose at this point, she decided to create a massive scene. She started shouting and screaming at the top of her lungs, making a fuss about why you didn't care about his mother's safety and why he wouldn't just surrender. She didn't hold back, exaggerating everything, even though she knew perfectly well that the old woman wasn't related to you. Surprisingly, the granny decided to cooperate with Tang and the silent demon. She suddenly began crying out for help, begging as if her life really depended on your actions. You, caught off guard, fell right into their trap. He awkwardly wanted to put an end to the madness, but at the same time, he didn't want to surrender and throw his life away. That's when Tang's plan started to work. The commotion drew a crowd as people gathered to see what all the noise and chaos were about. Things quickly escalated for you as onlookers began judging him harshly, saying things like, "What kind of person wouldn't care if his mother was killed?" Or, Would he really cut ties with his own mother just to save himself? You knew deep down that the granny wasn't his mother, but hearing all those ridiculous accusations from the crowd made him start to doubt himself. The pressure was getting to him, and he began reconsidering whether he should just do what Tang wanted to put an end to it all. But Tang's plan turned out to be a double-edged sword. Some of the onlookers shifted their attention to her, questioning her actions and mocking her. They called her a weirdo for giving herself the nickname Poisonous Phoenix and claiming to be the head of a noble family. Just like you, Tang found it hard to handle the judgment and ridicule. It was karma for her actions, and she was utterly helpless against it. However, being a 13-year-old, flat-chested, hyperactive kid, she couldn't stand hearing those insults thrown at her like that, so she decided to act. With a bit of effort, she pulled her small, half-buried body out of the ground. As soon as Tang got free, she called out to you, making both Seol and the boy turn around, only to realize their little troublemaker was on the loose again. This time, Tang wasn't in the mood to waste time messing around or giving some childish speech. Instead, she pulled out 8 poisonous darts from who knows where and declared it was time to settle everything once and for all and make a run for it. Poor Yu was left completely stunned. He barely had a second to catch his breath before things escalated even more. Every moment felt like it was spiraling further out of control, and now it had reached its breaking point. Without any hesitation, Tang threw all 8 darts at once, aiming straight for Yu and probably Seol too. As expected, Lady Seol effortlessly blocked all the incoming threats like it wasn't something she even needed to worry about. But what Seol didn't realize was that Tang had only been causing a scene to grab her attention, and it worked. The real danger was behind her. The silent demon had quietly aimed much larger darts at them. Lady Seol, despite everything, managed to block the dart at the very last second before it could hit her. But unfortunately, that wasn't the only dart. The silent demon had thrown another one, aimed at you, and she hadn't noticed it in time to block it. Being completely useless and unskilled, you just stood there doing absolutely nothing. He didn't even try to dodge. Instead, he simply accepted the dart with open arms. But the moment it hit him, he quickly realized he should have at least tried to move out of the way. The pain was unbearable. Seeing this, Lady Seol was left stunned. She couldn't believe what she was witnessing. The thought hit her hard. Her future husband might actually die because she underestimated their enemies. The poisonous dart didn't just hit the boy. It went straight through him like it was as fast as a bullet. Seol ran toward you and caught him in her arms. Even the landlord rushed over, panicking, afraid this might be the boy's final moments. Lady Seol couldn't stop blaming herself for everything, convinced it was all her fault. Her eyes filled with tears of regret, thinking that she could have saved you if only she'd noticed the sneaky attack a second earlier. She was sure you were done for, but when she looked at him, she realized he didn't look like someone on the verge of death. And then, to her shock, you said something strange. He didn't feel any pain at all, like he was totally fine. He just felt a little dizzy. Hearing this, Seol hugged him tightly, overwhelmed with relief that her ugly boyfriend was okay. You, feeling better now, hugged her back and apologized for making her worry so much. The landlord, on the other hand, stood there frozen. Not because of their emotional embrace, but because he was absolutely certain the dart had pierced your body and gone right through him. Seol had the same question burning in her mind. How could he be completely fine after something like that? You admitted he'd felt the impact too, but he brushed it off, thinking it was something as small as a needle. That's why he believed he was okay. Tang was listening to their conversation but decided to crush their hopes by saying those darts were coated with the deadliest venom, one that no one could survive. Standing there in her mismatched pants, she held up a small bottle of venom and called it the 100 fragrant root poison. You believed her instantly, horrified to realize it was the most potent poison from Tang's clan. The flat-chested girl went on to explain that the poison must have already started spreading through your body. She said that soon, when it reached his body's core, he would die in the most excruciating pain. You weren't feeling anything yet, but he was frozen in shock, wondering how such a tiny amount of poison on a single dart could do all of that before killing him. Then Tang revealed the final chilling secret behind the poison. She explained that the reason it was considered the deadliest was because it spread and multiplied using internal energy. The stronger someone's internal energy, the more lethal the poison became. At that moment, you suddenly understood why he wasn't feeling any pain. For someone like him with zero internal energy, the poison was completely useless, like smoking a cigarette and expecting instant death. Tang, however, didn't know that. She had assumed that someone carrying the Demon Sword of Chaos title would have an absurd amount of internal energy, enough to make the poison 100 times deadlier than it would be for an ordinary person. She was so sure of her assumption that she just stood there, waiting to see you collapse and die at any moment. But nothing happened. The only thing you felt was a slight stinging sensation at the spot where the dart or needle had hit him. On the other hand, the hyperactive kid couldn't help but wonder if she had miscalculated the timing or something, because by now the poison should have at least started showing some side effects. Before anything serious could happen, the landlord hurried off to grab some medicine just in case. Meanwhile, Lady Seol started crying again, bawling like a little kid, thinking that because of her mistake, you could actually be dead by now. A little distance away, Tang was staring at her dart, or needle, or whatever it was, wondering if she had forgotten to poison it. If that wasn't the case, then why wasn't the poison doing anything to the guy? Glancing at her poison bottle, the flat-chested, overly eager girl began to wonder if she had accidentally used something else instead of her clan's venom. To confirm her suspicion, she decided to test it out. Tang lightly tapped her pointer finger on the tip of the needle. It only took a few seconds for Seol and you to notice something was seriously wrong with the overly eager girl. That tiny amount of poison that entered her body with that tap was enough to send her into extreme agony. Exactly the kind of pain she had expected you to feel. But at least now she was sure the poison was working perfectly fine. Hours or maybe even days later, in an unknown place, after being lucky enough to have survived, Tang slowly started to regain consciousness. It didn't take long for her to recall the last thing that happened to her. She immediately sat up on the bed she was resting on and shouted, "Where am I?" You were sitting a little farther away, waiting for her to wake up. Without much emotion, he casually answered her question with, "You're in the village clinic." The last thing Tang expected to see was the so-called demon sort of chaos acting like he actually cared about her well-being. The boy didn't miss the chance to tease her and explained with a smirk how he had brought her there after her spectacular seizure on the ground. Then, with a creepy grin on his face, you added that they could continue and settle everything that got left unfinished before she passed out, if she was up for it. But Tang wasn't in any condition to do anything. Her body was still visibly trembling, the lingering effects of the venom reminding her just how potent her poison really was. She couldn't help but think that you must be someone who had achieved ultimate mastery over controlling internal energy, so perfect that even her deadly poison couldn't harm him. In simple terms, only someone as powerful as a sect leader could have pulled that off. Still clueless about the truth, Tang turned to you and asked, "Why did you spare my life even after I tried to kill you multiple times?" According to you, actually, Seol had been angry enough to let Tang die for hurting her precious boyfriend, but it seemed he had insisted on saving her. You claimed he convinced Seol by saying he had some unfinished business that only the two of them could handle. The flat-chested girl froze for a moment, realizing she was nothing more than a hopeless kid in front of him, thinking if even the lunar sword had surrendered to him, then someone like her had no choice but to accept whatever he said. Clenching her fists in frustration, Tang hated the idea of being defenseless and humiliated like this. She had dreamed of becoming a righteous hero, yet here she was, ending up as some kind of servant to a devilish guy. But as much as it burned her, she also realized something else. The rumors weren't true. It didn't seem there was any hostage situation or brainwashing that forced the lunar sword to defend this guy. You, still wearing his deadly serious expression, interrupted her thoughts and cut straight to the point, stating what they needed to do next. But the moment he mentioned her family and clan's name, before he could even finish, Tang jumped in and interrupted him. She might have looked like an impulsive kid, but she wasn't about to let her family take the heat for her actions. Firmly, she announced that she would personally take full responsibility for whatever he wanted her to do. That's when you didn't hold back and bluntly stated that she owed him 10,000 gold coins for the burned-down house and owe some extra for all the trouble she caused him. Without a second thought, she agreed, thinking she could easily gather the gold and pay him off. But here's the catch. There was a huge problem. You wanted the first payment right now. Tang, on the other hand, didn't even have a single gold coin to her name. So you decided to get creative there. He suggested she could do something instead if she really wanted to pay off the debt faster. And no, it wasn't that kind of dirty thing you might be thinking. Instead, they headed to the landlord's guest house, where Tang was stuck working as an attendant for him. She'd have to keep at it long enough to clear her debt before she could go. Now, as a noble girl and a martial artist, Tang struggled hard with her new job. For the most part, it was a nightmare. She couldn't stop complaining to you every chance she got. She never imagined the demon sword would drag her into something like this, working to pay off her debt. In her head, she thought you and his wife were planning to do something forbidden or sinister to her body. But nope, it was just her wild imagination running loose. She snapped out of her daydream the moment someone shouted, "For guests just arrived. They need service on the second floor." Before Tang could even react, Seol, in front of everyone like they didn't even exist, plopped herself right onto your legs and rested her head on his chest. She seemed a little suspicious that Tang might be up to something shady or planning to hurt him in some way. So even when you told her to get up, she flat out refused. You, on the other hand, calmly explained that he didn't think Tang would try anything. He believed she wasn't going anywhere or doing anything to hurt him. She had already admitted her mistake and was willing to make up for it, no matter how long it took or how much they made her suffer. And with Seol being all cute and lovely on his lap, you couldn't even bring himself to think about forcing Tang to pay off her debt in any dirty or twisted way. The girl got convinced, but from the way you were acting, like barely holding himself back, it made it clear for Seol that something was bothering him. For a split second, Seol wondered if maybe her weight was bothering him, or if he was just embarrassed to be in such a situation in public. She attempted to get up and head back to her seat, but before she could, you wrapped his arm around her waist and stopped her. Even if he was a little embarrassed, he wasn't about to hold back from comforting the love of his life, even in public. And just like that, the two of them went right back to acting like lovesick teenagers, rubbing and fondling each other like no one else was in the room. Nobody around could handle watching that scene, but the landlord and Tang were the exceptions. They just stood there, wondering how on earth that adorable goddess could be so in love with that ugly, no-good rascal. Meanwhile, in a city on the other side of the country, Tang's assistant was making her way through a packed, noisy street, feeling absolutely miserable from the heat. Even though it was spring, the temperature was unbearable for her. That was until she revealed her little secret. She'd been hiding her true identity under a perfectly crafted mask this whole time. But since no one in this city would recognize her anyway, and to help herself cool down, she decided to take it off. As soon as she did, she felt a lot better. She figured she could rest here for a while before the next time she crossed paths with you and Lady Seol, a moment she couldn't wait to experience again.